Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition, and we are reading The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. And today we're going to start with Chapter 1, and this will be Part 1 for today. Okay, here we go. Chapter 1, The Journey to Jekyll Island. The secret meeting on Jekyll Island in Georgia at which the Federal Reserve was conceived, the birth of a banking cartel to protect its members from competition, the strategy of how to convince Congress and the public that this cartel was an agency of the United States government. The New Jersey railway station was bitterly cold that night. Flurries of the year's first snow swirled around streetlights. November wind rattled roof panels above the track shed and gave a long, mournful sound among the rafters. It was approaching 10 p.m., and the station was nearly empty except for a few passengers scurrying to board the last southbound of the day. The rail equipment was typical for that year of 1910, mostly chair cars that converted into sleepers with cramped upper and lower berths. For those with limited funds, coach cars were coupled to the front. They would take the brunt of the engine's noise and smoke that somehow always managed to seep through unseen cracks. A dining car was placed between the sections as a subtle barrier between the two classes of travelers. By today's standard, the environment was drab. Chairs and mattresses were hard. Surfaces were metal or scarred wood. Colors were dark green and gray. In their hurry to board the train and escape the chill of the wind, few passengers noticed the activity at the far end of the platform. At a gate seldom used at this hour of the night was a spectacular sight. Nudged against the end rail bumper was a long car that caused those few who saw it to stop and stare. Its gleaming black paint was accented with polished brass handrails, knobs, frames, and filigrees. The shades were drawn, but through the open door, one could see mahogany paneling, velvet drapes, plush armchairs, and a well-stocked bar. Porters with white serving coats were busying themselves with routine chores, and there was the distinct aroma of expensive cigars. Other cars in the stations bore numbers on each end to distinguish them from their dull brothers, but numbers were not needed for this beauty. On the center of each side was a small plaque bearing but a single word, Aldrich. The name of Nelson Aldrich, senator from Rhode Island, was well known even in New Jersey. By 1910, he was one of the most powerful men in Washington, D.C., and his private railway car often was seen at the New York and New Jersey rail terminals during frequent trips to Wall Street. Aldrich was far more than a senator. He was considered to be the political spokesman for big business. As an investment associate of J.P. Morgan, he had extensive holdings in banking, manufacturing, and public utilities. His son-in-law was John D. Rockefeller Jr. 60 years later, his grandson, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, would become vice president of the United States. When Aldrich arrived at the station, there was no doubt he was the commander of the private car. Wearing a long fur-collared coat, a silk top hat, and carrying a silver-tipped walking stick, he strode briskly down the platform with his private secretary, Shelton, and a cluster of porters behind them holding assorted trunks and cases. No sooner had the senator boarded his car when several more passengers arrived with similar collections of luggage. The last man appeared just moments before the final "all aboard." He was carrying a shotgun case. While Aldrich was easily recognized by most of the travelers who saw him stride through the station, the other faces were not familiar. These strangers had been instructed to arrive separately to avoid reporters and, should they meet inside the station, to pretend they do not know each other. After boarding the train, they had been told to use first names only so as not to reveal each other's identity. As a result of these precautions, not even the private car porters and servants knew the names of these guests. Back at the main gate, there was a double blast from the engine's whistle. Suddenly, the gentle sensation of motion, the excitement of a journey begun. But no sooner had the train cleared the platform when it shuddered to a stop. Then, to everyone's surprise, it reversed direction and began moving toward the station. Again, had they forgotten something? Was there a problem with the engine? A sudden lurch and a slam of couplers gave the answer. They had picked up another car at the end of the train, possibly the mail car. In an instant, the forward motion was resumed, and all thoughts returned to the trip ahead and to the minimal comforts of the accommodations. And so, as the passengers drifted off to sleep to the rhythmic clicking of steel wheels against rail, little did they dream that riding in the car at the end of their train were 6 men who represented an estimated 1/4 of the total wealth of the entire world. This was the roster, excuse me. This was the roster of the Aldrich car that night. 1. Nelson W. Aldrich, Republican whip in the Senate, chairman of the National Monetary Commission, business associate of J.P. Morgan, father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller Jr. 2. Abraham Piatt Andrew, assistant secretary of the U.S. Treasury. 3. Frank A. Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank of New York, the most powerful of the banks at that time, representing William Rockefeller and the international investment banking house of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. 4. Henry P. Davison, senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. 5. Benjamin Strong, head of the J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. And here's a footnote about Benjamin Strong. In private correspondence between the author and Andrew L. Gray, the grandnephew of Abraham P. Andrew, Mr. Gray claims that Strong was not in attendance. On the other hand, Frank Vanderlip, who was there, says in his memoirs that he was. How could Vanderlip be wrong? Gray's response: he was in his late 70s when he wrote the book and the essay in question. Perhaps the wish was father to the thought. If Vanderlip truly was in error, it was perhaps not so significant after all, because, as Gray admits, Strong would have been among those few to be let in on the secret. In the absence of further confirmation to the contrary, we are compelled to accept Vanderlip's account. Alrighty then. Number 6, Paul M. Warburg, a partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company, a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France, and brother to Max Warburg, who was head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. Boy, that's a mouthful. Warburg. And here's a footnote about that. In the first 27 printings of this book, Charles D. Norton of J.P. Morgan's First National Bank of New York was listed as one of the attendees. However, thanks to the impeccable research of Michael Steenweg in Hudsonville, Michigan, it now is clear that this was not possible. Steenweg uncovered historical documents and private papers of the Norton family showing that Mr. Norton, 1, was not with the Morgan Bank in November of 1910. 2, was the personal secretary of President Taft at the time. And 3, during the dates of the Jekyll Island meeting, he was with the president on a fact-finding trip in Panama. Further, none of the memoirs of the other attendees mention Mr. Norton's presence. The reason he was placed on the list originally is that his name is included in numerous respected references on this topic, including J. Lawrence Laughlin's The Federal Reserve Act, Its Origins and Problems, New York, Macmillan, 1933, and a book by Tyler E. Bagwell, historian of the Jekyll Island Museum, entitled Images of America, the Jekyll Island Club, Charlton, South Carolina, Arcadia, 1998. However, based on the historical documents uncovered by Steenwick, it is this author's conclusion that Norton was not at the meeting, nor was there any apparent reason for him to be. Where error crept into the story is not clear, but this history is too important to allow it to be contaminated by myth. Boy, this author is very thorough. All right, concentration of wealth. Central control over financial resources was far advanced by 1910. In the United States, there were two focal points of this control, the Morgan Group and the Rockefeller Group. Within each orbit was a maze of commercial banks, acceptance banks, and investment firms. In Europe, the same process had proceeded even further and had coalesced into the Rothschild Group and the Warburg Group. An article appeared in the New York Times on May 3rd, 1931, commenting on the death of George Baker, one of Morgan's closest associates. It said 1/6 of the total wealth of the world was represented by members of the Jekyll Island Club. The reference was only to those in the Morgan Group. It did not include the Rockefellers or the European financiers. When all of these are combined, the previous estimate that 1/4 of the world's wealth was represented by these groups is probably conservative. In 1913, the year that the Federal Reserve Act became law, a subcommittee of the House Committee on Currency and Banking, under the chairmanship of Arsène Pujol of Louisiana, Arsène Pujol of Louisiana, completed its investigation into the concentration of financial power in the United States. Pujol was considered to be a spokesman for the oil interests, part of the very group under investigation, and did everything possible to sabotage the hearings. In spite of his efforts, however, the final report of the committee at large was devastating. Your committee is satisfied from the proofs submitted that there is an established and well-defined identity and community of interest between a few leaders of finance, which has resulted in great and rapidly growing concentration of the control of money and credit in the hands of these few men. Under our system of issuing and distributing corporate securities and under our system of issuing and distributing corporate securities, the investing public does not buy directly from the corporation. The securities travel from the issuing house through middlemen to the investor. It is only the great banks or bankers with access to the mainsprings of the concentrated resources made up of other people's money in the banks, trust companies, and life insurance companies, and with control of the machinery for creating markets and distributing securities, who have had the power to underwrite or guarantee the sale of large-scale security issues. The men who, through their control over the funds of our railroad and industrial companies, are able to direct where such funds shall be kept, thus to create these great reservoirs of the people's money, are the ones who are in a position to tap those reservoirs for the ventures in which they are interested and to prevent their being tapped for purposes which they do not approve. When we consider also in this connection that into these reservoirs of money and credit, there flow a large part of the reserves of the banks of the country, that they are also the agents and correspondents of the out-of-town banks in the loaning of their surplus funds in the only public money market of the country, and that a small group of men and their partners and associates have now further strengthened their hold upon the resources of these institutions by acquiring large stock holdings therein. By representation on their boards and through valuable patronage, we begin to realize something of the extent to which this practical and effective domination and control over our greatest financial, railroad, and industrial corporations has developed, largely within the past 5 years, and that it is fraught with peril to the welfare of the country. And this was from, here's a footnote, this was from Herman E. Cross, editor, Documentary History of Currency and Banking in the United States, New York, Chelsea House, 1983, Volume 3, Final Report from the Pujo Committee, February 28, 1913, pages 222 to 224. Such was the nature of the wealth and power represented by those 6 men who gathered in secret that night and traveled in the luxury of Senator Aldrich's private car. Destination, Jekyll Island. As the train neared its destination of Raleigh, North Carolina, the next afternoon it slowed and then stopped in its switching yard just outside the station terminal. Quickly, the crew threw a switch and the engine nudged the last car onto a siding, where just as quickly it was uncoupled and left behind. When passengers stepped onto the platform at the terminal a few moments later, their train appeared exactly as it had been when they boarded. They could not know that their traveling companions for the night, at that very instant, were joining still another train, which within the hour would depart southbound once again. The elite group of financiers was embarked on an 800-mile journey that led to Atlanta, then to Savannah, and then finally to the small town of Brunswick, Georgia. It would seem that Brunswick was an unlikely destination. Located on the Atlantic seaboard, it was primarily a fishing village with a small but lively port for cotton and lumber. It had a population of only a few thousand people. But by that time, the sea islands that sheltered the coast of South Carolina to Florida already had become popular as winter resorts for the very wealthy. One such island, just off the coast of Brunswick, had recently been purchased by J.P. Morgan and several of his business associates, and it was here that they came in the fall and winter to hunt ducks and deer and to escape the rigors of cold weather in the north. It was called Jekyll Island. When the Aldrich car was uncoupled onto a siding at the small Brunswick station, it was indeed conspicuous. Word traveled quickly to the office of the town's weekly newspaper. While the group was waiting to be transferred to the dock, several people from the paper approached and began asking questions. Who were Mr. Aldrich's guests? Why were they here? Was there anything special happening? Mr. Davison, who was one of the owners of Jekyll Island and who was well known to the local paper, told them that these were merely personal friends and that they had come for the simple amusement of duck hunting. Satisfied that there was no real news in the event, the reporters returned to their office. Even after arrival at the remote island lodge, the secrecy continued. For 9 days, the rule for first name only remained in effect. Full-time caregivers and servants had been given vacation, and a new carefully screened staff was brought in for one occasion. This was to ensure that none of the servants might recognize by sight the identities of these guests. It is difficult to imagine any event in history, including preparation for war, that was shielded from public view with greater mystery and secrecy. The purpose of this journey was not to hunt ducks. Simply stated, it was to come to an agreement on the structure and operation of a banking cartel. The goal, as is true with all cartels, was to maximize profits by minimizing competition between members, to make it difficult for new competitors to enter the field, and to utilize the police power of government to enforce the cartel agreement. In more specific terms, it was to create a blueprint for the Federal Reserve System. Oh, sorry, my allergies running. My allergies acting up here. Okay. The story is confirmed. For many years after the event, educators, commentators, and historians denied that the Jekyll Island meeting ever took place. Even now, the accepted view is that the meeting was relatively unimportant and only paranoid unsophisticates would try to make anything out of it. Ron Chernow writes, the Jekyll Island meeting would be the fountain of 1,000 conspiracy theories. And this was from Ron Chernow, The House of Morgan, An American Banking Dynasty and the Rise of Modern Finance. New York Atlantic Monthly Press, 1990, page 129. Little by little, however, the story has been pieced together in amazing detail, and it has come directly or indirectly from those who actually were there. Furthermore, if what they say about their own purposes and actions does not constitute a classic conspiracy, then there is little meaning to that word. The first leak regarding this meeting found its way into print in 1916. It appeared in Leslie's Weekly and was written by a young financial reporter by the name of B.C. Forbes, who later founded Forbes magazine. The article was primarily a praise of Paul Warburg, and it is likely that Warburg let the story out during conversations with the writer. At any rate, the opening paragraph contained a dramatic but highly accurate summary of both the nature and the purpose of the meeting. Picture a party of the nation's greatest bankers stealing out of New York on a private railroad car under cover of darkness, stealthily hiding hundreds of miles south, embarking on a mysterious launch, sneaking on to an island deserted by all but a few servants, living there a full week under such rigid secrecy that the names of not one of them was once mentioned, lest the servants learn the identity and disclose to the world this strangest, most secret expedition in the history of American finance. I am not romancing. I'm giving to the world for the first time the real story of how the famous Aldrich Currency Report, the foundation of our new currency system, was written. And this was from Men Who Are Making America by B.C. Forbes, Leslie's Weekly, October 19, 1916, page 423. In 1930, Paul Warburg wrote a massive book, 1,750 pages in all, entitled The Federal Reserve System, Its Origin and Growth. In this tome, he explained, the results of the conference were entirely confidential. Even the fact that there had been a meeting was not permitted to become public. Then, in a footnote, he added, though 18 years have since gone by, I do not feel free to give the description of this most interesting conference concerning which Senator Aldrich pledged all participants to secrecy. And here's a footnote that was from Paul Warburg, The Federal Reserve System, Its Origin and Growth, New York, Macmillan, 1930, Volume 1, page 58. An interesting insight to Warburg's attendance to the meeting came 34 years later. In a book written by his son, James James had been appointed by FDR as director of the budget, and during World War II was head of the Office of War Information. In his book, he described how his father, who didn't know one end of a gun from the other, borrowed a shotgun from a friend and carried it with him to the train to disguise himself as a duck hunter. That's funny. And that was from James Warburg, The Long Road Home, New York Doubleday, 1964, page 29. This part of the story was corroborated in the official biography of Senator Aldrich, written by Nathaniel Wright Stevenson. In the autumn of 1910, 6 men went out to shoot ducks. That is to say, they told the world that was the purpose. Mr. Warburg, who was of the number, gives an amusing account of his feelings when he boarded a private car in Jersey City, bringing with him all the accoutrements of a duck shooter. The joke was in the fact that he had never shot a duck in his life and had no intention of shooting any. The duck shoot was a blind. And this was from Nathaniel Wright Stevenson, Nelson W. Aldrich in American Politics, New York, Scribner's, 1930. RPT, I don't know what that means. Report. Anyways, New York, Kennicott Press, 1971, page 373. Stevenson tells us that shortly after they arrived at Brunswick, the station master entered the private car and shocked them by his apparent knowledge of the identities of everyone on board. To make matters worse, he said that reporters were waiting outside. Davison took charge. "Come outside, old man," he said, "and I will tell you a story." No one claims to know what story was later, sorry, I missed a line there. No one claims to know what story was told standing on the railroad ties that morning, but a few moments later, Davison returned with a broad smile on his face. "It's all right," he said reassuringly. "They won't give us away." Stevenson continues, "The reporters dispersed, and the secret of the strange journey was not divulged. No one asked him how he managed it, and he did not volunteer the information." And that was from Stevenson, page 376. In the February 9th, 1935, issue of the Saturday Evening Post, an article appeared written by Frank Vanderlip. In it, he said, "Despite my views about the value to society of greater publicity for the affairs of corporations, there was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. We were told to leave our last names behind us. We were told further that we should avoid dining together on the night of our departure. We were instructed to come one at a time and as unobtrusively as possible to the railroad terminal on the New Jersey littoral of the Hudson, where Senator Aldrich's private car would be in readiness, attached to the rear end of a train for the South. Once aboard the private car, we began to observe the taboo that had been fixed on last names. We addressed one another as Ben, Paul, Nelson, Abe. It is Abraham, Piat, Andrew. Davison and I adopted even deeper disguises, abandoning our first names. On the theory that we were always right, he became Wilbur and I became Orville, after those two aviation pioneers, the Wright brothers. The servants and train crew may have known the identities of one or two of us, but they did not know all, and it was the names of all printed together that would have made our mysterious journey significant in Washington, in Wall Street, even in London. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would be wasted. If it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress. And this was from Farm Boy to Financier, from Farm Boy to Financier by Frank A. Vanderlip, the Saturday Evening Post, February 9th, 1933, page 25 and 70. The identical story was told 2 years later in Vanderlip's book, bearing the same name as the title, New York, D. Appleton, Century City, 1935, page 210 to 219. The structure was pure cartel. The composition of the Jekyll Island meeting was a classic example of cartel structure. A cartel is a group of independent businesses which join together to coordinate the production, pricing, or marketing of their members. The purpose of a cartel is to reduce competition and thereby increase profitability. This is accomplished through a shared monopoly over their industry, which forces the public to pay higher prices for their goods or services than would be otherwise required under free enterprise competition. Here were representatives of the world's leading banking consortia: Morgan, Rockefeller, Rothschilds, Warburg, and Kuhnlo. They were often competitors, and there is little doubt that there was considerable distrust between them and skillful maneuvering for favored position in any agreement. But they were driven together by one overriding desire to fight their common enemy. The enemy was competition. In 1910, the number of banks in the United States was growing at a phenomenal rate. In fact, it had more than doubled to over 20,000 in just the previous 10 years. Furthermore, most of them were springing up in the South and West, causing the New York banks to suffer a steady decline of market share. Almost all banks in the 1880s were national banks, which means they were chartered by the federal government. Generally, they were located in the big cities and were allowed by law to issue their own currency in the form of banknotes. Even as early as 1896, however, the number of non-national banks had grown to 61%, and they already held 54% of the country's total banking deposits. By 1913, when the Federal Reserve Act was passed, those numbers were 71% non-national banks, holding 57% of the deposits. And here's a footnote on that. C. Gabriel Coco, The Triumph of Conservatism, New York, the Free Press of Glencoe, a division of the Macmillan Company, 1963, page 140. In the eyes of those duck hunters from New York, this was a trend that simply had to be reversed. Competition also was coming from new trends in industry to finance future growth out of profits rather than from borrowed capital. This was the outgrowth of free market interest rates, this was the outgrowth of free market interest rates, which set a realistic balance between debt and thrift. A little hiccup there. Let me get a drink of my coffee here. 1 second. This was, right here. This was the outgrowth of free market interest rates, which set a realistic balance between debt and thrift. Rates were low enough to attract serious borrowers who were confident of the success of their business ventures and of their ability to repay. But they were high enough to discourage loans for frivolous ventures or those for which there were alternative sources of funding, for example, one's own capital. The balance between debt and thrift was the result of a limited money supply. Banks could create loans in excess of their actual deposits, as we shall see, but there was a limit to that process. And that limit was ultimately determined by the supply of gold they held. Consequently, between 1900 and 1910, 70% of the funding for American corporate American corporate growth was generated internally, making industry increasingly independent of the banks. Here's a footnote on that. William Greidner, Secrets of the Temple. Grider, Secrets of the Temple. New York, Simon and Schuster, 1987, page 274, 275. Also, Golco, page 145. Even the federal government was becoming thrifty. It had a growing stockpile of gold, was systematically redeeming the greenbacks which had been issued during the Civil War, and was rapidly reducing national debt. Here was another trend that had to be halted. What the bankers wanted, and what many businessmen wanted also, was to intervene in the free market and tip the balance of interest rates downward to favor debt over thrift. To accomplish this, the money supply simply had to be disconnected from gold and made more plentiful, or, as they described it, more elastic. All right, we're going to stop here for now. That would be the end of part 1, and we will continue on part 2 next week. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a great week. Bye-bye now.